My sort of new concept is, if you look at education, and I've studied a lot, but
Yeah.
if you come out of that education, almost you can do nothing. You need that sort of second layer of practical experience.
Yeah.
And I want to sort of cut through that,
Yeah.
because the main thing is, when you go to Palestine, you say to people, look, you develop a fintech proposition. And they say, well, we've got no one here. And then they say, well, get the universities to train. And they say, well, the universities train, but we can't use these kind of people for months and months and months.
Oh,
For
right.
years. And so, we need something that's going to prepare our people. And for them, it's an opportunity to outsource as well. So you can, if you've got the skills in your country, you can
So
outsource.
in those countries, then, if they go to university to upskill, they have to go to university. It's not like they can do it.
No, they can do online. I mean, so at the moment, I think there's a German development agency that's providing them with online training from the German universities and stuff.
Yeah.
But you know how these training are, it's all learner history of the stuff. And, it's all about regurgitation, not about application.
Yeah. Yeah. No.
And so I'm sort of trying to come up with a new proposition, disruptive proposition, disrupting the education market, the executive education market.
It needs to be done.
Exactly.
And I think this crisis at the moment has thrown education up into a whole new light.
Exactly.
Across the Western world and other worlds, because actually parents are getting very good at homeschooling.
Yeah, exactly.
And I wonder actually if schools are making themselves redundant, or they're going to have to relook at how they teach.
Yeah, I was reading a book on education because of obviously this new venture, and the idea people are experimenting with kids is, instead of teaching them, teach them how to learn. Because they say, you've got everything out there on Google. If you want to do something, teach them, okay, how do I go and do a bit of research on Google? How do I find out how to actually apply this knowledge? And then they can go in any direction that interests them, rather than learning specifically. So, if I want to build an app now, okay, I need to learn maths. I better go and learn a little bit of maths. I need to learn programming. I better go learn, but there's a purpose to it, rather than just going through it.
I'd never thought about that, but yeah, because certainly me, if I want to learn something new, I'll just go to Google and find out and find a program.
That's how people learn these days.
Yeah, and
it's all about learning and how your brain adapts and things like that. And they say basically the whole university system and the whole school system is geared towards, cramming a whole lot of irrelevant, unrelated stuff.
Yeah.
In the morning, you're doing geography. In the afternoon, you're doing maths. There's no relationship between that. There's no kind of application behind it. And then the only way they test it is regurgitation. So anyone who's good at regurgitation does very well. Okay. And they sort of float up into the world, but they're not necessarily the best people.
No.
And if you find the entrepreneurs are totally the opposite. They find a problem. They find how to solve the problem.
Yes.
And they learn along the way. And that's kind of the new world, I think.
Do you think that new world is the difference between, say, the Western world that has gone along with a lot of traditional ways of doing things, and other countries that are coming up now with those new ideas because they almost have to? If you think about the poverty in the world and the way finance has changed and banking has changed and everything else, that has really pushed probably further. The Western world hasn't grasped it as much as other countries. Do you think it's the same with education?
Yeah, I mean, I think the necessity is the mother of all evils, or invention.
Yeah.
Either way you look at it. And so if people have got a need, then they will find ways. And now I think with things being opened up via the internet, you cannot go into an America and learn how somebody's done something without ever traveling. You can get onto a Skype or a Zoom conversation and speak to the person and say, look, tell us how to do it. And so I think in the past, it's, people wouldn't want to go into those countries and teach people. But now, somebody who knows how to do it and has got experience, it's a lot easier for them to sit in their bedroom or their living room or their office and teach somebody how to do something. I mean, I'll give you an example. I worked with a few startups in Mozambique. And they were planning to get through the sandbox, the regulatory sandbox. And I know one company, two guys got onto the internet and they learned how to program in blockchain.
Wow.
And just based on what they learned on YouTube, they created an application that's applicable in Mozambique. And then they created a business out of it, and then they got into the accelerator, and now basically, they're going for the license. So, it shows they didn't even contact anyone. They just literally went on YouTube and learned how to program.
Yeah. And actually that seems such an easier way to access it. Maybe not as easy for some people to learn that way, but then maybe the new future is about us having the opportunity to choose the way we learn and choose the way we use finance and choose the way we do things. Do you think there is more?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of sort of learning, it's nowadays, if you even in places like Mozambique, mobile phone is the in thing in most of the developing world. So these younger generation are growing up natively with that kind of technology.
Yeah.
So they've always got access to YouTube, and they're looking at movies and things like that. So it's a lot more easier and lot more natural for them to learn through those channels than it is for maybe, the older generation who likes a classroom type of education.
It's interesting because I said to somebody when this lockdown thing started that I think, and this is purely a sort of a thought of mine, that some of the big boys that the big companies that virtually dictate how we do things, that they are probably in more danger over all this than the small, innovative businesses and entrepreneurs that are springing up out of this. So do you think there's going to be that major shift in the way we look at business and who we do business?
Yeah, but I think it's interesting. It's a kind of a cycle. So you disrupt, and then you get disrupted. So if you think of the Googles and the Amazons of the world, they disrupted the Walmarts, and Google basically didn't have anyone to compete with, and they were the young pioneering, for the consumer. Now they're so big, basically they becoming very much like a JP Morgan or a Bank of America.
Yeah.
And it's more about how do we screw people. That's the just when you corporatize, when you become an enterprise, you sort of lose touch with your roots. And then profit becomes the big issue because you've got shareholders and you've got a different stakeholder to perform to.
Yeah.
And so you start to see, Google storing all sorts of information and potentially doing things that we don't want them to do. And similarly with Amazon, you're starting to see them influencing every part of your life.
Yeah.
Taking away that freedom. So now I think is the right time for somebody to come into that space and disrupt them. So the cycle continues. Those disruptors will then, become enterprises, and then they'll get disrupted. And that's the nature of the world. And I think that will accelerate. In the past, there were artificial barriers which these big companies would put up. Nowadays, everything is democratized. Anyone can go out and start an organization and get a mass following very, very quickly.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've noticed within my sort of contacts and networks and things is that we are now much more actively doing business with each other in order to support each other and to almost create some sort of social, I don't want to say justice, but that sort of improvement thing that our local economies keep going. And certainly where I am, we've all gone out and said, no, if I need it, I'll buy from you, you buy from me. As a global pandemic means we're all in the same boat. Do you think then that some of these businesses that are springing up, these enterprises and entrepreneurs are looking to do more good, whilst they're making their money to do more good in the world?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think if you're going to start a business going forward, if you don't have a purpose, you're going to really struggle. Because, if you look at the purpose statement of these newer companies that come through that succeed, and if you look at the purpose statement or the mission statement of a big bank, so big bank, I've come from a consulting world. A big consulting firm will be, we have 40,000 consultants across the globe. We operate in 52 markets. We make a profit of 1 billion every year, right? Now, if I'm a consumer, I'll say, so what, right? You're just going to rip me off, basically.
Yeah.
You're so big. Whereas a purpose-driven company, if you look at the PayPals of the world, or if you look at Stripe, they basically say, we want to eradicate poverty in the world. That might be one of their drivers. And we do that through the payment system. Or we want to make sure that, people are not getting ripped off. So they got a bigger purpose.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I did a little bit of research, putting my course together. But it's interesting. there's somebody did some research to see, what sort of attracts brands, or what attracts people to brands. And it is that bigger purpose. It's not the price, it's not the branding, it's not, the marketing, but it's, if somebody's got a purpose, I will rather pay, few p extra, and buy from them than a company that doesn't have a purpose and is only sort of being greedy. And so I think, if you have a purpose, and that's a selfless purpose, and that purpose is to actually improve your market, then generally you'll get people attracted to you. I call it magnetic market force. And so those kind of companies are sort of magnetically attracting their customers because, they're going out to do good in the world. If you think of Greta, what's her name, Gutenberg, and what she's doing and the following she's got, because there's a purpose, and the purpose is selfless. It's beyond her.
And I know, knowing you and sort of the fintech stuff you've done and working in finance and with governments and now pivoting, as they call it. Pivoting.
Adding rather than pivoting, yeah.
And do you think then for you that purpose-driven thing is what takes you through everything you do?
Yeah, so I think the reason I got into fintech is, so I've been in financial services for about 25 years now, just under 25 years. And, I think one thing that kind of hit me, I was working with a large corporation, a very big, this is a top 10 insurer in the world. So one of the biggest insurers in the world. And I remember this is the UK branch. I was sitting with their board at one stage, and a secretary came into the door into the boardroom, and she said to the CEO, "I need to speak to you quickly." And so he went out, and then he came in and he said, "Oh, we've got a customer downstairs. What do we do?" And they were all so nervous because a customer pitched up at the head office. They didn't have a clue. And that kind of, in my mind, that was a turning point to say, how far these organizations have gone away from their customers. And we've seen pre-2008, the problems, the financial services market was so domineering.
Yeah.
And basically they could get away with anything. The crisis opened that up and showed people that there was there was an opportunity to actually do good to individuals or to individual customers. And I think that sort of realization led people to say, okay, how can we do things better in the financial services space?
Yeah.
And so financial inclusion being one of them. In the old world, it's the banks and the insurers and the asset managers that took money from people like you and me, deposits or savings, and they channeled it into, building bridges, building big buildings. But the decision was made pretty much by them. And that's why I always describe money as kind of, blood in the body. So wherever money flows, wherever blood flows in the body, it nourishes that part of the body. Wherever it doesn't flow, you get gangrene and that part dies off. And similarly, money, wherever money flows, it brings prosperity. Wherever it doesn't flow, you're starting to get poverty. People poor, people haven't got water.
Yeah.
And I think now with fintech coming in, they're starting to discover how can we channel money, from the people who's got it to the people who most need it, rather than people who kind of want to just get more richer.
Yeah.
And therefore, my sort of mission is, if I went and started up a fintech company, I could only make so much impact. But if I can help, create the next Google in the fintech space, or help, 50 or 60 companies really scale, then they can make a much bigger impact. So my sort of mission is to help fintech companies scale so that they can go out and make a bigger impact in the world. And so there's a multiplier effect by me working with fintech organizations.
And I do think, because I often say to people, I worked in the community for many, many years, and I always used to say, you can't make big change if you don't make small change.
Exactly.
And it's that sort of adding up of all those little changes that creates a bigger change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the problem is, if you look at fintech companies, so financial services is a very hard market to get into as an entrepreneur. So, there's already from day one, as an entrepreneur, you kind of downtrodden. Then you get into the market, and initially fintech companies wanted to compete with big players, and they soon realized that the big guys are very big. It's a very, very big shark, and the fintech companies are a small little fish swimming in the sea. And so they decided to collaborate. Now, collaboration is great, and it works, But what normally happens is everything, the mindset of the big organization starts to actually get into or impinge the smaller organization, and the smaller organization eventually becomes like the big organization.
Yeah.
And therein the impact is gone. Others are being greedy, and all they're doing is they just want to be sold to a big corporation. And again, once the corporation buys it, that initial mission, vision they had, the purpose they had, is kind of gone.
Yeah. So, come on, the big question then, Jay.
Yeah, hello?
Yeah. How do you see the future panning out after all this, and in maybe finance and education?
I think we've just got a bad internet connection. Sorry, you might have to cut this out. But can you
Yeah,
see
no,
me
I can hear you, and
okay,
the sound
right.
was coming through.
Yeah, so I think the future is interesting. So COVID is going to have a huge impact on the economy.
Yeah.
And if you look at places like the UK, I mean, in any country in the world, the economy has kind of contracted, at the fastest rate ever. And so if you look at, the lockdown, and if you think of businesses, you look at individuals, people at the moment, they haven't got income, right? Government's supporting them to some extent.
For now.
So you're going to have this, I differentiate between financial inclusion and financial accessibility, as you know. Financial inclusion is, people focus on the 1.7 billion that don't have a bank account. So maybe they never want to have a bank account for various reasons. But there's a huge plethora of people, and these are billions of people who don't have access. So they have a bank account, but they don't have access to finance. They can't get a loan. A small business in the UK is a classic example. And I think that situation is just going to worsen. Now, if I look at traditionally how banks operated, and if you look at the credit models that they operate, those models are not going to work going forward, because if you came through the COVID process, your business is generally going to be not performing because it's due to no fault of your own. The current credit models only look at what's your income been, what's your payment, etc., and potentially they're going to mark you down because you couldn't pay your bills. The new fintech company is going to come in and say, look, we don't only look at those things. Let's take into account the COVID, and let's take into account other things that they have done to be more resilient, and work out a way to actually assess the credit outside the normal. And if those are the companies that then can go out and start lending in a more secure way to organizations, to SMEs. And so I think, there's more of a need now for these fintech companies to come in and actually close a gap now that's become wider than it was before. So post-COVID world, more of a need for fintech solutions, more of a need to disrupt the kind of traditional status quo, in my view.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I suppose sort of the one thing for me is, and I'm going to ask you this outright, do you think then that some of we will be able to I'll start that again as my mouth got all confusing. I'm thinking about some of these sort of countries that have a vast amount of poverty in villages, and even travel access to them and things like that. Do you think that this sort of mess we're in at the moment will actually be good for people in order to get maybe more women into education, more, people running their own little enterprises in places we wouldn't have thought of before, and the Western sort of way of doing things? Because I think after all this, a lot of businesses either go, well, actually, I can't afford to reopen, so everyone who's been furloughed will maybe made redundant or sacked or whatever. So do you see that those markets in areas we didn't see before, in the more poverty-stricken countries and third world countries, have a greater opportunity to fill some of those gaps?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Any adversity brings opportunity. So you can either see adversity and say, "Oh, my world is end," or you can see adversity and say, "Okay, I need to change things around." Now, if I look at before the crisis, even if you look at places like Africa, where you're living in a rural area, you don't have any access to a bank account. You can't. You have to travel 100 kilometers and spend lots of money to go to a bank. So what did these people do? Already this was very historic. They basically pulled together. So there's a villager, there's a statesman in the village who's respected by everyone. He will gather a kind of a boardroom of 5 or 6 leaders. They will then take money from everyone, and they will say, okay, we will now save it. And basically they have a mass account that they then open at a bank. So every time they go, they take 100 people's money and go and bank it at the bank. If anyone needs money, then basically they will have a little pool of so they become an intermediary, a bank branch, so to speak, informally, without actually involving the bank at all. There are other places in the Middle East where they have a kind of lending clubs. So everyone puts money into a pot, and every month someone gets all that money. So effectively, I save, let's say in pound terms, I save £100 every month.
Yeah.
And once a year, I get £2,000.
Wow.
Kind of a windfall. And so, there's those things already emerging. And I think similarly, the human population is very resilient, and people find ways of doing things. I think coming back to your point, when you said local versus global, I think definitely globalization is going to be something that's seen as not so good anymore.
Yeah.
Whereas in the past, it was all outsourcing and globalization. I think now people are going to think about how can we work with communities more closely. And there'll be opportunities in micro markets, rather than and a big enterprise that wants to conquer the world, potentially. So there'll be more local solutions emerging. Travel is a classic example. Let's move outside the financial industry. If you look at tourism, I think the tourism that we've seen, especially for British people hate to stay in the UK. And the staycation is going to become a lot more fashionable now.
Yeah.
The big holidays in Spain and the Canary Islands and Mexico and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, we've had some family things. My son didn't like flying, so we always ended up sort of staycationing, and that was really good. We enjoyed it because it's a lot more relaxing just to dump everything in a car and drive somewhere. A lot more fun compared to going on a plane. And when we used to tell people in the UK, we do that, they just couldn't understand why you would want to do that. Now I think the whole paradigm's going to shift.
Yeah, B&Bs are going to do pretty well over the summer, I think.
Exactly. Yeah, so I think similarly in the financial sense, if you can't now access global markets, or if you can't access loan from a bank, people will, in these days, I'm sure, there are people along the side who are relying on family to give them loans and things like that. So it's just going to happen. And I think that's going to exacerbate. So, I could see an opportunity for a platform coming out where, if you're giving to your family, then you give it through a platform potentially. So it's a bit more formalized. And the peer-to-peer lending industry is a classic example of that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.